And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Saturday marks the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. The poverty rate here in the United States has now risen to 13.2%, the highest level in 11 years. And around the world, 2 billion people, or a full third of humanity, are poor, living on less than $2 a day. 1 billion live in extreme poverty, earning less than $1 a day. The latest numbers from the United Nations indicate that over 1 billion people are going hungry each day. A new book from Amnesty International Secretary General argues that these harsh numbers alone don't tell the whole story. Economic solutions alone cannot fully address the deprivation, indignity, discrimination, insecurity, repression, and violence of poverty. Poverty, the book argues, must be recognized as the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
Bangladesh-born Irene Khan has been the Secretary General of Amnesty International for the past 8 years. Her book is called The Unheard Truth, Poverty and Human Rights. Joining us here in our Firehouse studio, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about the connection between poverty and human rights.
Well, you know, if you ask the poor people, what's your condition? What you hear from them is about discrimination. They can't get to school because they are women, they can't get jobs because they're an ethnic minority, they're excluded. You hear deprivation, you hear about discrimination, insecurity. Poor people live in fear of losing their jobs, losing their homes, not knowing where the next meal is coming from, and sometimes living in war situations. War impoverishes people. And so you can make economic investment, and maybe a farmer can improve his crop yield, but that does not guarantee the security of land tenure that he needs. You can build a school. That's one way of investing in the economy, but that doesn't ensure that girls will get to school as much as boys. So what I'm saying is that if you want to really help poor people get out of poverty, then you have to respect their rights and you have to empower them, because they will then demand their rights and through this process of dignity, get out of poverty.
Well, you argue in your book that the reigning approaches to eliminating poverty, foreign aid, technological development, trade, increased trade and investment, that these have failed. Why have they failed?
Well, they have failed very often because the emphasis has been on enrichment rather than empowerment. And if you take Africa, for example, investing in countries like Chad or the Democratic Republic of Congo has only enriched the powerful. A lot of money has been siphoned off, no investment has been made, the local communities haven't had their voices heard. So participation of people is absolutely essential. Freedom matters if you're going to tackle poverty.
You begin your book, Irene Khan, The Unheard Truth, with your own story. It's in the chapter, The World's Worst Human Rights Crisis. Describe what you were...
Well, what I was trying to figure out there was, in the same year, in my grandmother's house, I was born, and there was a little boy born to my grandmother's maid. And I have stayed in touch with him through this time. He went to school like me, but he was thrown out of school, dropped out, became a factory laborer, lost his job, became a rickshaw puller, now lives in a slum. And look at me. I was born in the same house. I went to school, got educated, went abroad. So what I enjoyed was access to certain resources that he didn't have, like education. But it was also an issue of status. He was discriminated because he was poor. And I was given opportunities. So what I'm saying is that you have to create opportunities for the poor, and those opportunities are often, the barriers to those opportunities are not only economic.
You attempt also to put a human face on the statistics by going to various parts of the world and reporting on the conditions there, the maquila workers, the women maquila workers in Juarez, in China. Talk about some of those direct experiences and how they've informed your overall analysis.
Well, if I talk about the women of Ciudad Juarez, now those women came from the poorest parts of Mexico, like Oaxaca and so on, and came to work in these maquiladoras to improve their economic condition. And sure, they did, but those women were then killed in very brutal ways, and the authorities did nothing. For years, hundreds of women disappeared, and the authorities did nothing. And when I went to speak to the mothers of Ciudad Juarez, the one thing they kept telling me is, no one cares, no one listens to us, we don't count. Now, I went back year after year to meet those mothers, and I have seen gradually how they've been able to organize themselves, how now they are actually allowed to go meet the governor, they raise these cases. So in a way, it wasn't just their economic condition, it wasn't just having jobs, it was actually giving them the space to be able to organize themselves and to get a voice that began to have some impact, although even now, of course, women are being killed there.
What do you mean by winning the right to the city?
Well, in this chapter, I'm focusing on slums. You know, there are 1 billion people in the world who live in slums, and that number will double in the next 20 years. And these are people who are coming very often to the city because of human rights violations, because they've been pushed off their land, because of poverty, but also because of economic opportunities. And yet, the city doesn't acknowledge them. They live in illegal neighborhoods without resources. I was in Kibera in Kenya in June, where Kibera is Africa's largest slum. There are 1 million people living there. There are water pipes that go through Kibera to provide water to the rich neighborhoods, and yet the people of Kibera don't have clean drinking water. You know, the narrow lanes become sewers when the rains come. So that's the way in which billions, 1 billion people are living in the world, feeding the economy, yet being ignored with no rights, subject to police brutality, to crime, to violence. And what I'm saying is that this reflects the failure of decades of housing policy. And governments need to focus on the right to housing. Housing is a right under international law.
Well, and you mentioned housing. We recently, a few weeks ago, had on Democracy Now! Some of the leaders of the slum dwellers movement in South Africa, a country supposedly that has gone through a liberation process, and yet they are battling against the existing government, removing people for the World Cup, and this issue of even progressive governments supposedly not dealing with these basic human needs of their population. What can be done from your perspective about that?
Well, in my book, I talk about Cebu City in Philippines, where actually the government was investing, but they were not talking to the people. They were evicting people forcibly and then giving them alternative housing in areas where they didn't want to live because they didn't have access to their jobs there. So then a group came together and began sort of talking with the authorities, started training the judges that look at eviction cases, started training local authority officials, and began a whole sort of discussion. There was an association set up where you had the local authorities, you had the local population, you had the judges and others who were dealing with these issues, and began to develop a housing policy that was responsive to people. So what I'm saying that even where governments are willing to put resources in, sometimes they don't listen to people, and that's why many of the development policies fail.
Irene Khan, do you think healthcare is a human right?
Healthcare is certainly a human right. I have a chapter in the book about maternal mortality. And, 500,000 women die every year giving childbirth or for pregnancy-related reasons. And pregnancy is not a disease. What I'm saying there is that women have a right to safe motherhood. People have a right to healthcare. You cannot rely solely on the market to ensure equal opportunities for all. That is why governments have a responsibility when it comes to human rights. And basic issues like health, education, security, they are human rights because without them, we wouldn't have human dignity.
So what do you think, as you come to this country, of the debate around healthcare?
Well, you know, it was, I think it was your president, Franklin Roosevelt, who talked about freedom from want, not just freedom from fear. And somewhere, I think, in those decades, the US has lost this emphasis on economic and social rights and sees them as not part of the debate of human rights. I hope very much that in the debate that's taking place, there will be a recognition that freedom from fear, freedom from want go hand in hand, and the right to health. US is the world's richest country, and there is no other country in the Western world, among developed countries, that do not provide health care to all its citizens. 40 million people without health care is shocking.
How do you assess the track record of the international organizations that are supposedly to deal with some of these issues, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, United Nations, and others, in finding ways to solve the problems?
Well, I use data and analysis from the World Bank in my book. And it's interesting when it comes to the World Bank that their own research and their own analysis, when they go talk to the people who are benefiting from their projects, they hear those people tell them that we need freedom alongside investment. And yet, when you look at the poverty reduction strategies that the World Bank develops, they actually acknowledge that, yes, freedom is an issue here, human rights are an issue, but we don't want to talk about it because it's controversial.